I just want to welcome everybody for joining the Sound Studies Institute this evening for our sixth talk this semester in our lecture series. So the University of Alberta, of course, is in Alberta, Canada, which is on traditional Treaty 6 territory. We're on a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous people, including the Cree, the Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Inuit, and many others. SSI is committed to ensuring that those histories and languages and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community, and we welcome everyone here tonight, and thanks for coming. If you're attending our talk for the first time, we just wanted to just let you know that we're the Sound Studies Institute. We're a research institute at the university that supports and promotes research and creative activities that involve sound in any way. And we're excited to have an extremely diverse series of talks this year. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in, and we're really excited and pleased to welcome Anja Arnhold, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics here, and she's also an affiliated researcher at SSI. She researches prosody, or if you like, the rhythm and melody of speech and its various functions in languages. So if you've ever wondered why Mandarin sounds so different from English, or for that matter, Cantonese, or why some words have totally different meaning depending on how you say them, then this talk is for you. And if those questions have never occurred to you, this could be your introduction to a fascinating research field that intersects with many others, from acoustics to sociology and even music. I'll just turn it right over to Anja, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. And so welcome, Anja, and we're excited to hear about how linguistic prosody shapes me.
Okay. Hello, thank you everyone for being here, and thanks to the Sound Studies Institute for inviting me. So like Scott already says, I want to tell you a little bit tonight about the many interesting things that prosody does, or that we do with prosody when we speak to each other. So when we use spoken language to communicate. And first I should, before I say anything else, give you a definition of what prosody actually is. So like Scott said, you can say that prosody is the melody and rhythm of speech. So that encompasses characteristics like pitch, length, loudness, and voice quality. So if you're a little bit into acoustics, pitch is the thing that can be measured as fundamental frequency, length can be measured as duration, loudness as intensity, and for voice quality, there's actually several different measures, and people aren't super agreed on which one's best, so I'm going to leave it at that. If you're not so much into acoustics, I have just thrown a bunch of words at you, which is not a nice thing. So instead, I would like to illustrate this with an example. And luckily, there is a way to filter speech so that basically all of the articulation goes away, and you can't really hear the words that are being said anymore, but you can still hear those prosodic characteristics. They get preserved in this low-pass filtered speech. So that's what I'm going to play to you. And this is also going to be our first poll for tonight. So this is going to be like tiny pop-up quizzes as a way of, Zoomified audience participation. And in Zoom, the way to do that is a poll. So Tom will hopefully soon start this poll, and I will play you, yes, oh, there it is. So I will play you 3 different sounds that are low-pass filtered, and one of them is a question. And so you will probably not understand what is being said, but you might still be able to hear which one the question is. And I've scaled all of these sounds to roughly the same loudness. So once you get your stuff sorted out, it should hopefully work for the rest of the presentation. So sound number 1. You didn't hear anything, did you? I didn't hear anything either. Okay. Sound number 2. And sound number 3. And again, number 1. 2. And 3. Okay. Votes are coming in. This is very excited. This is my first time doing this thing. Okay. And still moving. So we're going to wait for this a little bit. I might just play them once more in the meantime, because what else are we going to do?
Who wants to do something really funny? Who wants to do something really funny? Who wants to do something really funny? Who wants to do something really funny?
Okay, so things haven't moved in a while, so I think I can end the poll, and then all of us should be able to see the results. Yes, so that is actually awesome, and I thought that's how it would turn out. So it seems all of you are really good at picking out the questions. So if I go forward, most of you picked the sound number 1. And if I play this without the low pass filtering, you'll be able to hear what is being said and be able to confirm that this is indeed the question.
Who wants to do something really funny?
He wants to go for a nice long walk later.
He wants to do something really funny.
Okay, so the question has this very characteristic rise on who and then really high pitch until the end of the sentence. And that's really very typical for questions that we have this pitch rise, whereas the other two utterances are statements and they end with pitch falls. And that's one of the things that prosody can do. It can distinguish between questions and statements. Okay. So the next thing is that prosody differs between languages. And that's also something that I put in the abstract and that Scott alluded to. That is one of the things that I find most interesting about prosody, the way that it differs between languages. So let's do the same thing again with poll number 2. Again, it's going to be low pass filtered speech, and one of them is English. And due to the filtering, probably you won't be able to understand the words, so that way you won't be able to see it. But let's see if you can figure out which one is English just from the prosody. So, oh, there's the poll. Awesome. So I'm going to play the sounds. This is number 1. Okay. Number 2. Okay, and number 3. Okay, and I'm going to play them all once more. If you want to do this like second level difficulty, you can try to guess what the other languages are as well. Okay, so number 1. Number 2. Okay, and number 3. Okay. I'm going to play them once more because we have 91% of votes, but maybe somebody else wants to still do it. So. Okay, number 2. And 3. Okay. So here are the results. We have a clear winner, and indeed that one is English, which I think is awesome. To me, these 3 languages sound very, very different prosodically, and it seems that most of you share this intuition, which is great. So most of you said number 2 is English, which is indeed the case. So here on the left, you see a visualization of these sounds. And so the top one, I don't know if anybody guessed the other 2 languages. So the top one is Inuktitut, that's in black. The medium one, the purple one, is English. And then at the bottom in turquoise, I would say, is Mandarin. So these languages I picked not just randomly, but because I think they very well represent 3 different types of languages from a prosodic point of view that can be called. Oh, wait, before I wanted to tell you what those types are, I wanted to tell you what the picture shows. So each of these three parts of the figure, which is the one we used in the advertisement, has two parts. On the top is the waveform, which is a way of depicting the sound waves as they disturb the ambient air pressure. And that's the kind of thing that you see also sometimes when you listen to sounds on your phone, or it's a common way of depicting sounds. And as you can see quite clearly where there's speech and where there's silence. And when there's silence, there's a relatively flat line. You can see other things, especially if you zoom in, but I won't go into that so much. What interests us mostly here is that you can see where speech is and also how loud it is and how loud the parts are relative to each other. And below that is the fundamental frequency, which is the thing that corresponds to our perception of pitch. So how high or low a voice is. And you can see in the top one, which is Inuktitut, that there is, in these three different parts, which is where the female and male speaker take turns, at the end of each of these turns, there's a kind of drastic pitch fall. And then within each of these utterances that these speakers make, there are smaller pitch falls. And these are really, really regular. So each word actually has a little pitch fall. And that's what gives this impression of this very, very regular prosody. And then below you have English, which is quite varied. I think the speaker was Australian, the female speaker at least, but I'm not sure now anymore. And then at the bottom you have the Mandarin, where you see many very small pitch movements that happen in a really short span of time. So here is my characterization of types following Caroline Ferry's suggestion. So those languages that, like Inuktitut, mark chunks of speech, which here are words, and then larger chunks that are utterances, with the same pitch pattern. So each word has the same pitch pattern, which is a fall here. Those languages we can call phrase languages because they use prosody to mark off phrases, to chunk speech into smaller units that are marked prosodically. In intonation languages, like English, words can have very flexible pitch patterns, and we do a lot of different things with that. Whereas in tone languages like Mandarin Chinese, each word has a fixed pitch pattern, and that's why we have these many fast movements. Okay, and so I will go into detail to illustrate what I've said here for each of those three types, and then hopefully it will make a bit more sense. Okay, so here's an illustration, another illustration for Inuktitut, which comes from a corpus of speech that is a website for learning Inuktitut. And I have the reference at the end, so all of you can go and learn Inuktitut if you want to. So this website was created by Inuit, and there's also two native speakers who have spoken these dialogues. And my colleagues, Richard Compton and Emily Elfner, and me approached these people to ask whether we could use these materials for research, and they kindly said yes. So what we did was we went through the corpus and annotated all the words for their pitch movements. And we found it was almost 300 words that varied in length between 1 syllable and 9 syllables long. But almost all of the words, except for one, had a pitch fall, which is beautiful. So that's where this very, very regular impression comes from. Now I have to move all of our videos to the other side so I can play you this sound. But see that some of the words are quite long and quite complicated, and still they all have these pitch falls. Okay, so that's it for phrase languages. The prosody separates out chunks of speech that always get a fairly inflexible pitch pattern, in this case a fall, which I've marked here with the high and the low points, so the H and the L. Okay, tone languages. Here is probably the most famous example for this, which is the Mandarin syllable ma. So in the segmental terms, we have m and a. But that doesn't always mean the same thing. You might have seen this example before. So this ma can have 4 different meanings depending on the pitch that it goes with. So when it appears with high flat pitch, it means mother. And it sounds like this.
Ma.
When you have rising pitch, it means hemp.
Ma.
And when you have a little dip and then another rise, it means horse.
Ma.
And then when you have falling pitch, it means to scold.
Ma.
And there is a couple of words in Mandarin that are so-called toneless, but most words have a fixed pitch pattern. And so that's why we get these very, very fast, many pitch movements in Mandarin speech that make this very characteristic impression that is very, very different from phrase languages and intonational languages, as we will see. So the pitch here really is integral to the meaning of the word. You have to get the pitch right so that the word means what it is supposed to mean. And almost every syllable has this pitch, and they do influence each other a little bit when you have them next to each other, but the pitch pattern is basically fixed due to the actual meaning of the word. So that's what we call lexical tones. Mandarin has these 4 different ones. Tone languages are actually probably the largest group of languages by far. Most languages in the world are tone languages. There's a lot of them in Asia, and there's a decent number in Middle, Southern, and Northern America. But there's also a large group in Africa, like many, many tone languages. So I wanted to show you an African tone language example, which is Yoruba. It doesn't have the same 4 lexical tones as Mandarin. That would be a little bit weird, but instead, in this language, there is 3 levels of pitch that get distinguished. So each word has either high, mid, or low pitch on its vowel in particular. And so here's an example. The word be can mean either to give birth, or to ask, or to vomit, depending on the pitch that you say it with. And so on the left, there's a figure that shows this word said in a frame sentence, which is say be aloud. So say to give birth aloud, say to ask aloud, and so on. And I'm going to play those first. And here, so the middle word is be, so it's so, and then be, and then soke. So see if you can hear the 3 different levels. I'm going to go from the bottom down. So first high pitch.
So be soke.
Mid.
So be soke.
And low.
So be soke.
And that's what you see in the figure quite clearly. The surrounding words are the same, so the pitch pattern is also pretty much the same. But in the middle, it really deviates, and you can see the high pitch, that's the blue line, and then the black line, which is the mid, and the low in green, which is a fall to a low point. And in case you found that a bit fast, I'm also going to play just the words by themselves with the high, mid, and low tone.
Be.
Okay, so they're clearly distinct, but if I were to learn Yoruba, I would have to train pretty hard to pay attention to every little syllable and which level it is. Okay, so those are tone languages. Each word, or almost each word, has one of a certain prescribed fixed possible patterns, and you have to have the right pitch for the word to have its literal meaning. So we had the phrase languages, we had the tone languages. Let's move to the intonation language, and again, go with English as an example. So intonation languages, like I said, are pretty flexible. The same word can appear with lots of different pitch contours. And here's an example. I like this especially because I didn't actually used to know what rutabaga means. And anyway, it's kind of, you would think that there's not so many ways to say rutabaga, but there is. So all of these different ways of saying rutabaga still mean rutabaga, but they still differ. So let me start with an example.
A rutabaga.
This is probably the most neutral way of saying this, in the sense that if somebody asked you what you have in your hand and you wanted to just neutrally say what you have in your hand, that might be the way you say it.
A rutabaga.
Then, so that's the, I don't know if you can see where my cursor is. That was the top left version. And then if we go to the top right version.
A rutabaga.
That's a little bit different, right? Like it's still a statement, but she sounds either like she's surprised or very proud, or she is contrasting this with something else. So the pitch changes and the meaning changes in this sense, but it still refers to the same word, to the same object or type of object in the real world. But the meaning changes in the sense of some kind of different level of meaning, more on a pragmatic level. And then if we look at the bottom left, where you have rising pitch,
a rutabaga?
That's a question, right? Or maybe a suggestion. And then here, the bottom right one is my favorite of these. Oh, sorry.
A rutabaga?
Yeah, I really like this one. She sounds kind of annoyed. So there's also a way of expressing attitudes. And so the general idea with intonation languages is that you can kind of dissociate the words and the pitch patterns. So you have a set of pitch patterns that don't change the meaning of the literal word, but they bring a contribution of meaning. And so you have a fixed association between the pitch pattern and its meaning. So for example, we have the rise there, the meaning of that is question. And we have this fall that you have here on the left, that's a meaning of like neutral statement. So you have a set of a fixed association between the forms, the prosodic forms, and their meanings. And these kinds of associations between forms and meanings that are fixed and conventionalized and have to be learned when you learn the language, that's exactly what we call grammaticalized. So this is really a part of grammar for intonation languages, that you have these sets of pitch patterns that have certain meanings, but don't change the actual word meanings, but they have a different level or kind of meaning contribution. Okay, and the flip side of one word can appear with different pitch contours is the same pitch contour can appear with different words. So let's start with the neutral statement rutabaga.
A rutabaga.
Amelia.
So this is arguably the same pitch pattern on Amelia. This one sounds a little bit different because she's speaking a bit faster, and I've cut it out from a sentence, so kind of stops a little bit, but it sounds similar enough to say that it's the same pattern.
A rutabaga.
Amelia.
And then the other accent.
A rutabaga.
Amelia.
Yeah, so that also has the same kind of whatever you think it is. I think it sounds a little bit surprised or maybe proud. Okay. I think that's all I wanted to say about this. So we have a lot of flexibility, but it's not random. It's used to express things. And these things are kind of conventionalized and coded. Okay. Oh, and the other thing in which way it's really not random is that you can do a lot of things with different pitch movements, but you can only do them in certain ways. So if you have a pitch movement, the kind of core of this pitch movement has to be on the stressed syllable. So you can say a rutabaga or a rutabaga, but you cannot say a rutabaga. That's kind of weird. Or a rutabaga. That's odd. You have to put the pitch movement on the stressed syllable. And then there's a whole class of words that actually change their meaning when you change the stress. And one of these cases, or there are several classes, but one of them is words that can be nouns or verbs depending on where the stress goes. So here is an example of record versus record. So I wanted to keep a record of the conversation versus I wanted to record the conversation. So you have the record, the noun on the left, and the record, the verb on the right. And what you can see here, if you look at the waveform on the top first, is that in the case on the left, where the first syllable is stressed, it's louder. And it's also longer than that same syllable is on the right, where it's not stressed. And the stressed syllable in both words is louder than the unstressed syllable in both words. And if you look at the pitch, you have a pitch fall in both cases. And the peak of the fall, the high point from which we fall, is on the stressed syllable in both cases. You could also have the rising pattern, so you could say record or record, but then you would have the lowest point, the starting of the rise, on the stressed syllable. Okay, I'm also going to play them spoken by a native speaker, because that's not me. But that's pretty much the way you guys would probably say it.
Record. Record.
Okay, so like I said, there's a whole class of words. There's also present, present, digest, digest, object, object, subject, subject, and so on, whole class of words. And so this is, if you think of it, kind of a little bit similar to the Mandarin cases that I showed you earlier, and that the actual meaning of the word will change with the pitch, with the stress, but the pitch itself is not the thing that determines things. The pitch itself is flexible. It's only important that the pitch is on the stressed syllable. So the location of the stressed syllable can change the word meaning, but the pitch itself is free. Okay, so that's it for the 3 different types of languages. So I hope this makes sense. Now that I've gone through it, we have these phrase languages that are pretty inflexible in that the only thing that prosody does is it puts kind of the same pattern on chunks of speech, and that helps figuring out what these chunks are. Like, it's very easy to detect words in Inuktitut because they all have these pitch falls. Whereas in intonation languages, words are very flexible and we do lots of different, usually pragmatic things with it. Whereas for tone languages, each word, or almost each word, has a fixed pattern. So we have these very fast movements. And at this point, now that I've gone through it, I just wanted to play the first phrase of each of these in the filtered version once more. So you hopefully now feel that this kind of makes sense. So here is the Inuktitut example again. Yeah, and the English. And the Mandarin. Okay. Next point that I want to show is that prosody highlights new or important information. So, right. There's going to be another poll, and I see that there's some questions in the chat, but I think I will answer those when I'm done, because otherwise I have too many things open and I get all scatterbrained. So here the question is, which of these three sounds that I'm going to play best answers the question, who knew him? So the sentence you're going to hear is Amelia knew him. And one way of figuring out what the new information is, so I want to know which sentence has Amelia as the new or important information. And one good way of thinking about this is Amelia will be the new information if the question is who knew him. So which of these answers, which of these statements would be the best answer to who knew him? So here's sound number 1.
Amelia knew him.
Number 2.
Amelia knew him.
And number 3.
Amelia knew him.
And again, number 1.
Amelia knew him.
2.
Amelia knew him.
And 3.
Amelia knew him.
Okay. I somehow lost the poll. Up, there it is.
Amelia knew him.
Amelia knew him.
Amelia knew him.
Okay, this is great. I think everybody has voted, so to speak. So here you can see the results. Most people clearly suggested number 2 as the best answer, which is what I would agree with. Very few people chose number 1, which I would also agree with. And some people chose number 3. So, and I think that's basically reflects what I would say. So the first one, the most prominent word is new. Let me show you the pictures, please. Awesome. So for sound number 1, you see that there's a pitch. Amelia is pretty flat, but we have a rise on new, which makes it kind of prominent. And then on him, the pitch only falls to the end of the sentence. Whereas both number 2 and 3 have prominent pitch movements on Amelia, the most prominent pitch movements in the sentence. And then the rest is relatively uninteresting, so to speak. So that makes sense that the number 1 would probably not be a good answer to a who question. That would be a good answer like, did Amelia just meet him? No, Amelia knew him. Or maybe, how do we know we can trust him? Amelia knew him. I'm going to play that one once more.
Amelia knew him.
Number 2 seems to be a really good neutral answer to the question, who knew him?
Amelia knew him.
And number 3, I think, could also be an answer, but that again to me has this extra connotation that she's surprised, or maybe she's contrasting it with something.
Amelia knew him.
So I'm glad you guys agree. The one thing I want to also still point out about this is that, as is typical for intonation languages, really not all words will have pitch movements. And as we see quite nicely illustrated here, there is usually one word, sometimes more, in a short phrase that has a prominent pitch movement, and the rest kind of goes along until something happens towards the end of the phrase. And that's really what makes English so distinct from Mandarin, let's say, where really most syllables have some pitch movements. Whereas here, most syllables don't. There's only the stressed syllables of some words where something interesting happens. Okay, so what I wanted to illustrate with this, apart from that general point, is prosody highlights new or important information. And then the interesting question is, well, how does that happen in a language like Mandarin, where each syllable, or not each syllable, but almost each syllable will have a prescribed pitch movement? So let's look at Mandarin. I didn't put any references here. Obviously, this has been quantitatively researched too, but I just want to show you a few illustrative examples. If you are a Mandarin speaker, these might sound quite over distinct, because I did literally put a student in a sound booth and say, no, say it again, say it clearly. And he knew what this was about. So this is, I did an actual production study with many participants, and they do basically the same thing, but not quite as clearly. So I wanted to show you these very clear examples. So here are two sentences in a kind of very neutral context where we don't necessarily want to highlight anything in particular. So on the left, you see a sentence that has been carefully constructed so that each syllable has what's called the tone number 4, so the falling tone pattern. And on the right, we have one with tone 1, so that's the high flat tonal pattern, which makes things much easier to see if all the syllables have the same tone. And so on the left, we have a context like you've met a friend with whom you have mutual friends you haven't met in a while, so you start to gossip about your mutual friends, and then at some point the other person asks, so what else is new? And then you say, Dan Tring graduated. So you haven't mentioned this person and you haven't mentioned graduating, so everything's new. And on the other hand, on the right side, it's like the context is something like you're meeting a friend at work and it's late, and so they ask you why aren't you locking up the office? And then you mention that your colleague Fang Wen is working overtime. And so again, you haven't mentioned the person, you haven't mentioned working overtime. All of this is new information. And after all this talking, let's listen to it. So this is the one on the left with the falling tones.
邓庆毕业.
Okay. And this is the one on the right.
方温加班.
Yeah, so you can really hear the tones. They're quite distinctive. And here's a version where something is new. So here we have a context on the left where we have talked about two of our friends, mutual friends, and we know that somebody graduated, but we didn't quite catch who was the one of the two who graduated. So we ask who graduated. And on the right, it's similar. You've already mentioned that there's two of your colleagues in the office and you know, or one of them is working overtime. So you're asking who is working overtime. And that again highlights the person who is the subject of the sentence. So I'm going to play the kind of neutral version first and then the version with the highlighting. But what you can see already when you look at the figures is that the tonal contours basically get preserved in that on the left, still each syllable has a pitch fall, and on the right, still each syllable has relatively flat and relatively high pitch. But you can see on the left that the highlighted word has kind of slightly expanded pitch faults, whereas everything after has faults, but they're quite compressed. And similarly on the right, where we have the flat tonal patterns, after the highlighted word, the whole pitch gets kind of compressed down a lot, and you can really hear that. So let's start with the falling tone patterns with the neutral version again.
邓庆毕业.
And the one with new information.
方温加班.
Yeah, so I think you can really hear that. I'm going to play that one again.
方温加班.
Okay, and the one on the right, again, starting with the neutral version.
方温加班.
And
方温加班.
Yeah, so you can really hear where the new information word is. And like I said, speakers don't always do it quite this distinctly, but if they do something, that's what they do. They preserve the tonal lexical tones, but they adjust the pitch range to highlight certain words and de-emphasize other words, so to say. And I'm not saying that that's what all tone languages do, but it's I would say a kind of a common way of doing it for a tone language to preserve the lexical tone, which is something you have to do. And then if you want to do something with the pitch, this is a good way of doing it. Okay. And then the next thing I should show you is how this is done with a phrase language. I'm going to switch phrase languages because I also did do this with another language, but I have done quite a lot of work on Finnish, and also I like Finnish. So the first thing I should do, though, is convince you that Finnish is a phrase language. And if you look at this, it already looks a lot like Inuktitut. There's other interesting similarities between Finnish and Inuktitut. But what you can see here is that you have, again, regular pitch faults that I've again annotated with high and low points. But what you can also see, probably already, is that there's actually a difference from Inuktitut, at least the South Baffin variety. I have to say that there actually is really not enough work done on the prosody of various varieties of Inuktitut, and they might differ quite a lot. So really, we looked only at the South Baffin in that study I referred to earlier. But there each word had its own pitch fall, whereas here sometimes words share pitch falls. So the first word, kortisa and näkyi, share a pitch fall, and that's typical. The finite verbs usually phrase with neighboring words. They don't get their own pitch falls most of the time. And I'll return to this. And then you see that the next two words also share a pitch fall. So we have rannikolla and oleva. So literally it means something like at the coast being. So the nature that was at the coast. And so this being at the coast together forms a unit that gets a pitch fall together. And then the last two words in the sentence also get their own pitch falls. Okay, and before I play this, I want to say one more thing. So the active among you may have noticed that the pitch tracking ends before the sentence ends. So what happens here is that at some point at the end of this phrase, the speaker falls into a kind of, he changes the voice quality from normal so-called modal voice quality to a kind of whispery voice quality. And these kinds of changes in voice quality at the end of phrases are very, very, very common in Finnish, like they are everywhere. And they mean that we can't track the pitch. So the measurement of fundamental frequency just breaks down at this point. And so that's why the pitch fall here that shows the pitch tracking at the end of the sentence ends before the speaker stops talking. So that's what you can see. You can still see in the waveform that there's something going on, but the pitch tracking ends. So I'm going to play this and see if you can listen to both these regular pitch falls and the whispery voice quality at the end of the sentence. Okay.
Kortissa näkyy rannikolla oleva luonto täydellisesti.
Yeah, like it's
Kortissa
really
näkyy rannikolla oleva luonto
really,
täydellisesti.
really like that. Okay, so highlighting of new information in Finnish. Here's another kind of neutral sentence. The context is literally something like, what's going on? So everything's new, and the new information is that Niilo is painting some cloth. This might not seem super noteworthy to you, but I will point out that all the segments are beautifully sonorant and the lexical quantity is nicely controlled. So there are reasons for these sentences. But what you can see is that, again, the verb, which is in the middle, doesn't have its own fall. So the first word has its own pitch fall, which is Niilo, and then the next two words kind of go together, and the middle word just has a rise of pitch to the fall that happens on the last word. And again, you can see that the pitch tracking breaks down in the end because the voice quality changes. And here the voice quality that you will hear is so-called creaky voice, or also called vocal fry, which is very typical, this kind of like voice quality that also Finnish people do a lot. People here in Canada do too, but Finnish people do this a lot. So listen to this.
Niilo liina.
So the last syllable is na. Okay, so what happens if the first word is highlighted as new information? So that would be a context like we already know, that somebody's painting a cloth. Who is painting a cloth? As a side note, Finnish doesn't have articles, so the a, it could be a cloth, the cloth, or just cloth. We don't really know. What you can already see is that it looks pretty similar, but you see that the fall on the first word when it's being highlighted is much larger, and that everything after is also a little bit compressed. And the creaky voice quality at the end starts earlier, so the pitch kind of that we can see and measure ends earlier. So I'm going to play this one once I find my cursor. Yes. Okay, let me play the neutral one again.
Liina.
And so I think that you can probably hear that the first word is highlighted. It really sticks out audibly. And this kind of adjusting of the pitch range while compressing things after looks a lot like the Mandarin thing we had earlier. And here is an example where the last word is highlighted. So we already know that Niilo is painting something, and we're asking what is Niilo painting, and he's painting cloth. And again, you can see that the pitch fall on the first word is compressed a little bit, and the pitch fall on the last word is expanded, but the contour overall stays quite the same. So I'm going to start again with a neutral one.
Liina. Liina.
So this is where the liina is new. And then when we highlight the middle word as new information, something interesting happens. So this is, we know that Nilo's doing something with a cloth, and we're asking, what is Nilo doing with the cloth? So the middle word, the verb, is highlighted. And as you can see, in this case, the verb gets its own pitch fall. And okay, I'm going to start again playing the neutral one. Sorry.
Niilo maalaa liinaa.
So you can
Niilo
really hear
maalaa
this.
liinaa.
And you can also see and hear that she drops into the creaky voice quality really, really early. There's a long stretch of eh. This, by the way, is also something that Finnish children do, and that's awesome. Creaky voice in 4-year-olds is just fantastic. I'm going to play this once more. So
Niilo
here,
maalaa
this is something
liinaa.
quite different from the Mandarin case. We do have still expansion and compression of pitch movements, but we also have a word that now gets a pitch movement, which it wouldn't or doesn't get normally in the neutral case. So that's something you couldn't probably do in Mandarin. But unlike English, what we have still put a pitch movement on a word to make it more prominent, but unlike English, it's the same pitch movement that we had all the time. There's still only these falls going on, nothing more. Whereas in English, you could have a falling pitch movement for new information, and you could have a rising pitch movement for question, and so on, like I showed you earlier. Okay, the next section is about how prosody helps listeners to predict what will be said next. This sounds a little bit like a magic trick, but it's not. In fact, this relates to what I just said about how prosody highlights new information. So this is, the origin of this is a study by Dept and colleagues, where people saw a grid like you see here. These are not their actual pictures, but it was a grid like you see here with 4 geometrical shapes, a diamond, a triangle, a circle, and a square, and a cross in the middle. And then around that, 4 different pictures. So here you have a candy, a necklace, a pear, and a candle. And then speakers were instructed to, doing this on the computer, they were instructed to click on one of these pictures and move it. And so if you think about giving these instructions, if you told somebody to first move the candle and then move the candle again, you'd probably say something like, put the candle below the triangle. Now put the candle above the square. So above the square, in particular, the word square would be prosodically made prominent. You'd put an accent on that. Whereas if you first move the candle and then the candy, you would say something like, put the candle below the triangle. Now put the candy above the square. So candy would become really, really prominent, and you would put an accent on candy. Okay? So far, I haven't really told you anything new. The cool thing about this is that this can be used to predict how this ends. So already when you hear the can of either candle or candy in the second instruction, you can know which word it is, even though you haven't heard the complete word. So if you here put the candle below the triangle, now put the can, and the can is pretty flat and not prominent and doesn't have an accent, you can infer that you're supposed to move the candle again. Because if you were to move the candy, candy would be accented. And the other way around, if you here put the candle below the triangle, now put the can, you can infer that you're now supposed to move the candy in the second instruction and not the candle again, because if you were supposed to move the candle again, the candle wouldn't be new information, it wouldn't be accented. And in fact, that's what listeners do. We can see that they can already predict how this word, what this word is, even though they haven't heard the complete word. We can see that they can already predict which one it is. The way that we can see this and the way that Dept and colleagues showed this in their study is with eye tracking. So people sat in front of the computer and did this task while listening to the instructions, and at the same time, their eye movements were tracked so that the researchers could see where on the screen they were looking. And they could then see that already during the beginning of this word, before they had heard and processed the whole word that was either candy or candle, the participants were already looking to either the candy or the candle, depending on whether the first part of this word was marked as new information prosodically, whether it was accented or not. I really like this study. It doesn't end there. So what this study has shown is that the presence or absence of an accent by marking a word as new information or not, allows listeners to predict what this word is, what's going to be said next. In a new study with basically the same setup and items, Chen and her colleagues showed that not any accent will do. So they did this with British English speakers, and in British English, it is really only falling accents that mark new information. Whereas words can have accents and not be new information if they're, for example, rising accents. So it would be something like, the falling one would be, now put the candy, and the rising one would be something like, now put the candy. And these rising accents, British English speakers, or rather listeners, they didn't treat these rising accents as cues to new information. So only when they had the falling accents, candy, only then did they already look to the candy. So if they moved the candle, then they heard next a falling accent, they looked to the candy already. But if they moved the candle, then they heard something with a rising accent next, they still looked to the candle. They treated this as a cue to old information, which is, again, what this shows is that not all accents are the same. This harks back to what I told you earlier, that we have sets, inventories of prosodic forms. We have an inventory of accents, and each accent has a certain meaning. And only some of these are suitable. So only some accents mean new information here. Others mean something else, like, I want to kind of highlight this word, but this is not new information. I'm telling you, I want to highlight this word that you already know about. By the way, what exactly prosodic meanings are is a huge discussion that I'm not going to get into unless you force me. But instead, what I want to tell you is that really fitting with this idea of the fact that this is something that has to be learned, that is a grammaticalized association between meaning and form, is that when Chen and Lai did the same study with non-native speakers of English who were native speakers of Dutch, they didn't get this distinction between the falling and rising accents. They treated both kinds of accents as cues to new information. So when they heard move the candle and so on, and then move the can with either rising or falling accents, they had a tendency to already look towards the new item, in this case, the candy. So they hadn't learned they hadn't learned the different meanings of the accents, supporting the idea that this is something that you have to learn, just like you have to learn the rest of the language. And then the last thing is something that I was involved with. So we did that same study with Canadian speakers of English. And interestingly, the Canadian speakers of English did look quite similar to the non-native speakers of English, which makes a lot of sense because they are not native speakers of British English, and because prosody is not identical between British and Canadian English. So this really shows that languages and dialects differ, and this is really part of the language, this way of prosodic transmitting of meaning. Okay, that's almost it. For the last section, I want to return to where we started. So very early on with the first example, you guys actually demonstrated that prosody distinguishes questions from statements in English. Let's do the very same thing again. So I'm going to play two sounds, unfiltered, because you probably won't understand them. And so the question is, which of these two sounds is a question again? So sound number one is the one on top. And sound number two. Okay, and so which of the two is a question? Okay, I'm going to play them a couple more times because they're short. Number one. And number two. Okay, and this is Kalaallisut, which is the West Greenlandic Inuit language variety. Okay, so again, number one. And number two. Just hazard a guess. I mean, I know that most of you won't speak Kalaallisut, but I mean, try it. Okay. Yes, votes still coming in. Okay, I'm going to play them one more time.
Nenne sanava. Äijät ikävä. Äijät ikävä.
Okay, I think nothing has changed about the votes for a while. So here are our results. Almost everybody chose the first one. This makes a lot of sense because the first one is the one that has rising pitch, right? And in particular, it ends in a rise. So if this was English, this would be a question. Okay, so here is the, so most people said that number 1 on the left is the question. However, the cool thing is that in Inuktitut, Kalaallisut, it's the other way around. So the rising intonation is what you typically find for statements, and the falling final pitch falls are what you typically find for for questions. So it's exactly the other way around than in English, which is, it's really cool. This has actually been, there's a lot of discussion about how, to what degree prosody is iconic and just natural and just something that happens versus something that is really grammatical and that has to be acquired with the rest of language. And while we have found a lot of languages where rising pitch does signal questions and falling pitch does signal statements, there is also some counterexamples, and I really like this one. Do you want to hear them again? You want to hear them again? Who doesn't want to? Okay, so here's the statement again. Here.
Nenne sanava.
And the question.
Äijät ikävä.
Which is the opposite of English.
A rutabaga. A rutabaga?
Okay, and then also there's languages where pitch doesn't clearly signal questions. The end. So Finnish, again, is a nice example. On the top, you have a statement.
Maini neuloi loimia.
So Maini knitted a blanket. And then below you have, does Pia knit a blanket?
Piako neuloi loimia.
Okay, I'm going to play both again.
Maini neuloi loimia. Piako neuloi loimia.
And so at this point, somebody should ask, and somebody would probably ask if this wasn't a Zoom talk, so how do people know which one is the question if we don't do this rise fall thing? And the answer is, at least for Finnish, that we mark that with the words we're saying. So many cases you have a question word like who, where, what, and then you know it's a question. You don't actually need prosody. And actually, if you think of it in English, quite often, if you have a question word, you don't need the rise at the end. So if you say something like, who was there with a fall? Perfectly fine. We do it all the time. It's only if we don't have a question word like, I was invited. That tells you I'm asking you, was I actually invited? Whereas if I say I was invited, I know that it's a statement. So in Finnish, if there's no question word, there's a little particle. And you see that here, I've marked it out separately at the bottom, the ko. So Pia ko means, is it Pia who knitted a blanket? And so that's what is regularly done in Finnish. You have this little question particle that marks this thing is a question, and it gets attached to the word that you're asking about, and it's put to the beginning of the sentence. So if you wanted to ask, is it a blanket that she's knitting, you would ask loimeako maini neuloi. And in fact, Kalaallisut and other Inuit language varieties also have a marking that is non-prosodic. So you see here that on the top where we have a statement, the verb is sanavok with vok, which is the typical ending for third person singular in a statement, whereas at the bottom, the verb ends in va. So va is the question form for that. Okay, I think that is basically it. So to sum up, prosody can do lots of things. It can distinguish word meanings, though it doesn't do it in all languages. It can also mark out words, although it doesn't do that equally in all languages. And that's one thing that I haven't gone into at all, but that's quite interesting from the point of view of language acquisition, with the idea that children use prosody to discover units of speech. And that's how they break this continuous blabber that falls onto them down into small units, and they learn phrases and words. Prosody can distinguish questions from statements, although it doesn't have to. And it can highlight new information or important information, although there's also languages where it never does that. Prosody can allow listeners to predict upcoming speech, at least in certain conditions, or it can disambiguate statements in certain conditions, and it can signal, and usually does signal, the emotional state or attitude of the speaker, like the woman who's very annoyed about rutabagas, but also generally you can hear from somebody's prosody how happy or sad they are. And then there's a lot of other things that I haven't even touched on today. Another really fun thing about prosody is that it can be studied in lots of different ways. So I've shown you basically examples of acoustic measurements. So you could get those from a carefully controlled production study, which is what I usually do, and then you can do lots of statistics with that. Or you could also take a corpus of spontaneous speech and do an analysis of that acoustically, or something in between, like these scripted Learn Inuktitut examples that I did that weren't designed for linguistic study, but are scripted because the two speakers knew beforehand what they were going to say. And the nice thing about prosody is that even with not perfect sound quality, you can usually get some measurements. So you can study a wide range of data. And on the other side of it, you can study how people perceive prosody, and there you can get very creative. So you can do complicated things like eye tracking, or simpler things like I give you a context and I play two sounds to you and I ask which one fits better. Or actually what you guys have been doing with me today, that now we can show a randomly chosen group of people can distinguish English questions from English statements purely on the basis of prosody. Okay. That is it. Those are all the references and sources that I've cited throughout. Now we could go to questions, or we could do a bonus quiz, up to you guys. But at least I'll stop talking. Thanks for listening so far.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I think before we have questions, let's everybody give a little round of applause in whatever creative way you'd like to do that. That was just great. We do have time for a couple of questions, and I have some, but I'll save mine. And I guess, I mean, usually we ask people to raise the blue hand or to put the question in chat, or just unmute yourself and ask the question, unless we look like we're going to have a big. It looks like Reinhardt is raising his hand. So please go ahead and unmute yourself, Reinhardt, and then Camille will be next.
Okay, so thank you. That was very interesting. It's a subject that interests me. And I'm teaching 2 workshops at McEwan University in the music department, one on the music of Wagner and one just called What Makes Music Tick. Mm-hmm. And I have already recommended this talk to the participants in that, and I'll do that again. And because even the second workshop will look sometimes at how the shape of a musical phrase that is a song with words, mm-hmm. will be influenced by the prosody of the words themselves, yes. All kinds of stuff like that.
Yes, actually there's research about how, although I couldn't point you to exactly where it is, but I have heard that there's research about how the native language of a composer influences their music, which I think is awesome. That's not what I do, but I love it.
Thanks.
Okay, we'll go to Camille next, and then we have a question from Dominic from the chat, but we'll go with Camille. So if you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, Camille.
Cool. Hopefully you can hear me. I think so.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for the great talk.
Thank you.
So I'm a PhD student, and I'm working at the intersection of music and voice, and particularly the singing voice. So this stuff is really interesting to me too. And I'm wondering from an acoustics standpoint. So when you're trying to incorporate measuring stress, is the main acoustic correlate of that loudness? Is that like the right, I guess, the definition of stress? I'm wondering if you can expand on that a bit more.
Yeah, that is a really good question. That doesn't have a completely straightforward answer. So there's 2 parts. What are the correlates and what do I actually mean when I say stress? And both of them are kind of complicated. And what are the correlates is kind of the easier question, because you can go ahead and measure it, right? And if you do, then you see that it does depend on the question, on the language. So languages differ a little bit. And so in particular, if a language has both tone, like Mandarin and the lexical tone sense, and stress, like English, which does happen, then the the tone is often not the cue for the stress, or like pitch is not the cue for the stress because pitch is already the cue for the tone. But and also this has developed over time. So at the beginning, like early 20th century, people thought that stress is clearly cued by loudness, but then some people found that actually the pitch is more reliable as a cue. And then again, people discovered that, hey, in all of these studies, people had made the word where they measured the stress the new information. So you had kind of conflated what we call stress with kind of marking new information. But this is something that if you do a carefully controlled study, you can check that. And there's a very cool, relatively recent pair of 2 meta studies by Timo Röttger and Matthew Gordon that looks at this typologically. So they took a large sample of published studies and checked both what are the methodologies that people use in one paper, and in the other paper, what are the cues that people use. And if I don't very much misremember, duration was the most common cue, I want to say.
Ah, okay.
But yeah, and the other question is, what is stress? Which is something that has recently fascinated me a lot. So I mean it in a very specific sense in this thing that, like in English, you actually either change the meaning of, well, so the most common definition in the linguistic sense would be you have one syllable that's the most prominent in the word, and that would be the stressed syllable. But then what does prominence mean, right? But usually, so in English, you have tons of cues. You have the loudness, you have the duration, and you have a lot of segmental phenomena. So for example, a sound like T at the beginning of a stressed syllable is like T. Whereas you have something like the pronunciation of butter as butter, that only happens preceding an unstressed syllable. So if you were to write an account of English sound systems, you couldn't write it without stress because so many things happen there. That was probably like a kind of very messy thing. If you want to talk more about this later, I would love to, because I think that stress is very fascinating. But yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to. No, thank you. I mean, I think it just highlights that it is like something that's really hard to define.
It is.
And an ongoing like research question, perhaps.
There's also something where in many Inuit languages, every second syllable of all of the syllables have short vowels. Every second one will lengthen the vowel. And then I wonder, is that stress? Should we really call that stress? Because that seems very different from English, but it's also rhythmic in a similar way. So there's tons of cool questions out there.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So we have thank you for that question. There's a question in the chat, which is really about notation. I'll just read the question. Other than pitch movement diagrams that you showed, are there other attempts at notating prosody with text? I can imagine playwrights, for example, want to specify it. And I can say from the field of music, certainly there are notations that are derived from this. In fact, I think that some of the really oldest music notation is indeed derived specifically from those kinds of drawings. But I wanted to open the question up to you about other notations you might be aware of.
Yeah, well, linguists also kind of have a different point of view and kind of different goal from musicians. So particularly for many people, I think what the mainstream is, and certainly what I work in, is something called the autosegmental metrical model, which I won't go into detail, but basically the idea is that you try to account for everything with assuming 2 different levels, high and low pitch, that are relative to a speaker's register and where they are in the utterance, because we often go kind of downward in pitch over the course of an utterance. So a high tone at the beginning of an utterance is higher than a high tone at the end of that utterance. So that kind of corresponds a bit to those high and lows that you have seen there. And so for English, you could, for example, make the inventory of accents, and you could say there's a falling accent, so that would be high-low, and a rising accent that would be low-high, and something that's just a high accent that's just high. So that's pretty common. There's also attempts to do that same thing with underlying linear functions. That works well for things like Mandarin. And a couple of others where you have accent commands. But these kinds of notations are so there's kind of codified annotation systems. Actually, one thing that I cite there, I forgot that one. It's cited on the slides and I forgot to put it there. Veilleux and colleagues, that's a course on how to learn a specific codified North American standard English annotation system called Toby. So if you Google that, hopefully you'll find it. There's a whole MIT course about this prosodic annotation system.
So we have a question in the chat from Alejandro. Is there any classification of language with more or less quality of sound changes? I wonder if maybe he means timbral.
Or yeah, like voice quality.
Yeah, maybe.
Yes, awesome. No, there is. So one thing that I really, really like about prosody is how it does different things in different languages. And like it can do basically anything that any other aspect of or part of grammar can do. So there are some languages where voice quality changes change the meaning of the word, like in the tone does in Mandarin. Many languages in Middle America do that. I want to say Yucatec Maya, but I might be wrong. But I can't think of an actual example, but a hypothetical example would be that ma, and ma would mean different things. Let's say table, chair, and guitar. So that's a thing that some languages do, that they have these kinds of so-called lexical meaning differences that are marked by voice quality. Otherwise, I don't think that anybody has attempted a voice quality like typology, so to speak. I have to say that I kind of dabble in voice quality things in that because it's so important in Finnish, I started coding it for my data, and it does actually really mark new information. So in my data, I decided to not overwhelm you with 1,000 charts, but it comes out statistically that when you have new information, at the end of the word that's the new information, everything afterwards is more often creaky or whispery. And that's actually, that comes out in these examples that I've shown you, like the verb thing, where basically at the end of the verb and everything after, and you can actually see that quite clearly too in the, if you look at the waveform at the top, you can see that it has this kind of it doesn't have these neat regular vibrations, but you can really see that the voice quality there changes. So that's actually something that comes out statistically. And that is something that I would argue you mark the phrase boundaries with these special kinds of voice quality. And basically what you do when you mark something as new is everything afterwards is like the end of the phrase. It's marked as final. So that's at least two cool things that people do. But they also do sometimes, I think, sociolinguistic things with voice quality, like using creaky voice for women, I think sometimes to lower your register in a way and kind of speak authoritatively. And I think, oh yeah, right, there is this very cool study on Finnish, Ogden and Rotarinna, I think, where if I'm not very much mistaken, they showed that these creaky voice things are also interpreted by the other person as a turn-taking point. So when I go to the creaky register, I signal, oh, you can jump in, you can start talking. If I don't mix that up with their other study on the rises, that final pitch rises elicit back channeling. But that's kind of it there. I don't think there's a whole typology.
All right. Well, I think maybe these are such good questions. Thank you for your.
They were great questions. Yeah.
And maybe we're about at time. So I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Let's give her one more round of applause. You're welcome to unmute yourselves if you like. A little bit of noise here. Thanks everyone again for coming, and just have a wonderful evening and enjoy the snow.
Yes, thank you.